The clatter of silverware echoed too sharply against the old dining room walls. We were gathered for supper on Munjoy Hill, the smell of baked haddock still lingering when my mother drove her fork into the table as if she were staking a claim. Her voice followed, sharp and unshakable. "You have 24 hours to get your things out. This house is your brother's now." The words didn't sound real at first. I searched my father's face, hoping for contradiction, but he never lifted his eyes from his plate. My brother Rogan leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a smug line tugging at his mouth. I felt the weight of silence pressing down harder than any storm off Casco Bay. I looked around the room I had poured years into fresh paint on the trim, windows I'd had replaced after the last nor'easter, the sturdy floorboards I refinished with my own hands. None of it mattered now. In one sentence, I was erased. My chest tightened, but I refused to give them the argument they were prepared for. I set my napkin on the table and pushed back my chair without a word. My mother's eyes narrowed, waiting for me to explode, but I would not give her the performance she expected. My father sipped his water like a man who had already chosen a side. Rogan smirked as if victory were already his. The house that had been my safe harbor was slipping from me, yet I kept my voice still and my steps steady. On the porch, the wind off the bay cut against my skin, but clarity came with it. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought 24 hours was all I had. It would be enough. The house lay quiet after the argument, every corner humming with memory. I walked slowly from room to room, my footsteps soft against the boards I had sanded myself. In the kitchen, the cabinets still carried the faint scent of varnish I'd brushed on during the late nights after work. When I stayed up to finish projects no one else cared to touch. My hands had scrubbed the stains out of this space. My paychecks had bought the new appliances, yet now it was claimed as someone else's gift. I drifted into the living room, letting my fingers graze the warm beige walls I had painted only 2 summers ago. I remembered standing on a ladder, roller in hand, determined to brighten the place after years of gray. Rogan had been gone then, off chasing contracts in other states, too busy to return calls. My parents had murmured appreciation at the time, but it hadn't lasted. Tonight, those walls stood mute, their glow dimmed by betrayal. Upstairs, I paused outside the small bedroom I had made my own. The storm of 5 years earlier came rushing back, wind tearing shingles from the roof, rain driving through leaks in the attic. My father had thrown up his hands, said there was nothing to be done without money. I had written the checks to the contractor, drained what savings I had, and signed for overtime at my firm to cover the rest. The repairs had held, proof that I could keep us safe even when the world outside raged. Near the stairwell, I touched the railing, still smooth where I had sanded splinters away. My grandfather Silas had stood here once, his voice rough but kind as he told me, "These boards will need your hands someday." At the time, I thought he meant simple chores, but now his words felt heavier, as if he had seen this night coming. I stopped at the front door, the air cooler there, salt from the harbor seeping in through old seams. The house seemed to breathe with me, holding the weight of all I had poured into it. Tomorrow I would need answers, and I already knew who to call. I barely slept, the house pressing in on me with a silence that no longer felt safe. At dawn, I wrapped a coat around my shoulders and stepped onto the porch, staring toward the eastern promenade where the bay was just beginning to glow with pale light. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I scrolled to Sloane Merrick's number. We had met years ago at Bodewin, both of us restless to prove ourselves. She'd gone into law, sharp-minded and uncompromising, and I had always trusted her judgment. When she answered, her voice carried the same no-nonsense edge I remembered. I told her everything: the dinner, my mother's decree, my father's silence, Rogan's smug grin. She listened without interrupting, only the faint scratch of her pen coming through the line. When I finally stopped, she exhaled slowly. "Maris, first thing, you are not being legally evicted. A parent shouting at dinner is not a notice. Maine law requires due process. They can't just push you out overnight." Her certainty steadied me. Still, the sting of betrayal clung to my skin. They gave me 24 hours, I said. They mean to hand it all to Rogan. Then we start with proof. She replied, receipts, mortgage records, any emails or contracts from when you covered their debts. And one more thing, probate files. Do you know if your grandfather left a will? The question jolted me. I remembered Silas's rough voice, his hand on the railing, telling me the house would always need me. He owned it until he passed. I whispered, but I assumed it went straight to them. Never assume, Sloane said firmly. If a will exists and it names you, your parents may not have had the authority to gift the house at all. I'll have someone search the probate court today. I leaned against the porch column, the cold seeping through my coat, but a flicker of warmth building in my chest. For the first time since last night, I felt less like a trespasser in my own life. I'll gather everything, I said. Good. The tide's already shifting. Don't waste energy on arguments, find the rocks and stand on them. Her words stayed with me as I went back inside, already pulling open drawers for folders of bank statements and receipts. By mid-afternoon, Sloane called, her voice tight with urgency. Maris, I found something. I pressed the phone hard against my ear as she explained. She'd had a clerk at the Cumberland County Probate Court pull every file tied to Silas Alden's estate. Among them lay a notarized will, dated 3 years before his death. It was simple, direct. With his broad signature stamped beneath the seal, the house on Munjoy Hill was left solely to me. My knees buckled, and I sank into the armchair I had bought with my first real paycheck. For a moment, the room tilted. I thought of evenings with my grandfather on the porch, his hand steady on mine as he pointed out ships crawling across Casco Bay. He had known. Somehow, he had looked past everyone else and trusted me to keep the house alive. Why didn't they tell me? My voice cracked. Because it didn't suit them, Sloane answered. The will was filed. Your parents had access to it, and they chose to act like it didn't exist. They couldn't stomach the truth that Silas passed over them, and over Rogan. A hot flush rose in my chest. I pictured my mother's narrowed eyes at dinner, my father's refusal to look at me, Rogan's smirk. The betrayal wasn't just in their words last night. It had been years in the making. They had buried my grandfather's decision to prop up Rogan, to protect his pride and give him a stage he hadn't earned. Sloane's tone sharpened. We can enforce this. I'll prepare a petition, but you need to stay calm. Gather receipts. Document your contributions. Keep everything organized. They'll fight. But the signature on this paper is stronger than their performance. I stared at the copy Sloane emailed moments later, the black ink stark on my phone screen. His handwriting the same loops I remembered on old letters named me as heir. They had hidden it, hoping silence would erase me. But the silence was ending. I stood, the decision settling into my bones like stone. If they wanted me out in 24 hours, then in 24 hours they would learn whose house this truly was. The next morning I moved quickly, determined to act before my parents returned or Rogan arrived with his suitcase. I called a local company, Portland Harbor Movers, and explained what I needed: a rush job, only a few large items, nothing more. The man on the line hesitated at the short notice, but by noon he promised to send a crew. While I waited, I walked through the house with a stack of sticky notes and a pen. I marked only what I had bought: the slate gray sofa I'd saved for months to purchase, the stainless steel washer I installed in the basement, the curtains I had chosen to match the beige walls. Each tag was both a memory and a receipt, proof of my labor when no one else would lift a hand. In the dining room, I paused at the oak table my grandfather had built decades earlier. The chairs around it were mine new, sturdy, bought after my mother complained about the wobbly ones. I marked them, but I left the table untouched. The cedar chest in the hall, filled with old quilts, I left as well. I wanted no accusations of theft. I wanted the truth clean. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Penfield from across the street watching. A few minutes later, she knocked softly and stepped inside, her eyes kind but searching. "You've always been good to this place," she said. "I've seen you paint, mend, haul things in storms. It's yours as much as his ever was." Her words steadied me more than she knew. Soon after, Tom Keegan stopped on his walk from the docks, dust still on his boots. He glanced at the porch beams I had reinforced years back. "Your grandfather would be proud," he muttered. By the time the movers arrived with their white truck, the rooms were mapped out in small squares of colored paper. I didn't take everything. I took only what was mine. And when Rogan walked through the door, that difference would matter more than he ever expected. The movers had just finished hauling the sofa into the truck when I heard the grind of tires on the driveway. Rogan stepped out of a rented sedan, a sleek black suitcase trailing behind him. He looked at the house as if it were already his stage, chin lifted, shoulders squared. He brushed past me at the door without a greeting. His shoes echoed on the bare floorboards, the emptiness of the room greeting him louder than words. He stopped short where the sofa had stood, turning slowly in a circle. "What the hell happened? I took what belonged to me," I said evenly. He swung around, eyes narrowing. "This is sabotage. Mom and Dad gave me this house, and you gutted it before I even had a chance to move in." I crossed my arms, refusing to meet his fire with my own. The washer, the chairs, the sofa, I paid for them. I have every receipt. Furnish it yourself if you want to call it home. His face flushed, but the anger broke with something else fear. He sank onto his suitcase, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand. My contracting business is falling apart. Investors are circling, and I promised them I'd have collateral." And his voice dropped. "Lila's pregnant. I need this house. It's not just for me." The words struck me harder than I expected. For a heartbeat, I saw the brother I had grown up with, knees scraped, chasing kites with me on the Eastern prom. But that boy was gone. Now he wanted my silence and my sacrifice to patch his mistakes. "I'm not your collateral," I said softly. "And our grandfather didn't choose you for this house. He chose me. You may not like it, but that's the truth." Rogan's jaw clenched, his desperation boiling into rage again. "You'll regret this. They'll make sure of it." I stood my ground, the sound of the movers shutting the truck doors punctuating the air. Rogan glared at the emptiness one more time, but what he saw missing was not furniture. It was his entitlement slipping out the door with them. 2 mornings later, I stood with Sloan inside the Cumberland County Probate Court, the copy of my grandfather's will clutched like a lifeline. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and polish, and my parents sat across the aisle, rigid as statues. Rogan shifted in his seat, restless, the skin around his eyes tight with sleeplessness. Sloan rose first. Her voice was steady as she outlined the chain of events Silas Alden's notarized will, the mortgage payments I had made, the receipts for repairs, the affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed my care for the house. She moved like she had rehearsed this for years. My mother's rebuttal came sharp and rehearsed. Silas always meant for the house to stay with the family. We assumed it was a matter of intent, not paperwork. My father nodded along, his eyes avoiding mine. They spoke of Rogan's needs, his future child, his role as the eldest. The judge interrupted, raising a hand. "Intent is not stronger than a signed and notarized document. This will is clear. The property belongs to Maris Alden. Until full probate enforcement is complete, no transfer or occupancy may occur. The restraining order stands." The gavel struck, and the sound rang like thunder. My parents flinched. Rogan's face hardened, and for the first time since the dinner on Munjoy Hill, I felt the ground hold steady beneath me. Afterward, I returned to the house. The movers had left it half empty, yet the silence no longer felt like loss. I walked into the kitchen, opened the drawer where loose keys rattled, and selected the old brass one Silas had kept on a leather string. I placed it on the counter, not as an offering, but as a marker. This key was no one's bargaining chip. It was the proof of what had already been decided, years before I ever thought I would need it. When I locked the door behind me, I knew the battle was not finished, but the story they had written about me was already breaking apart. The official deed came in the mail a week later. my name written where my parents had tried to erase it. I sat at the small desk in my apartment and traced the letters with my finger, not with triumph, but with an unfamiliar stillness. The court had sided with me. The law had affirmed what Silas left behind, yet I felt no urge to plant a flag in the living room and claim victory. Instead, I walked the streets around Munjoy Hill, pausing at the waterfront where I had stood with my grandfather as a child. He believed in houses not as trophies, but as anchors, places that kept families and neighbors steady through storms. I thought of Mrs. Penfield watching from her porch, of Tom Keegan nodding at the beams I had repaired. They were part of this story, too. The idea came quietly. I would keep the deed, but not in the way my parents or Rogan imagined. I met with a representative from a local land trust, one that protected homes for working families along the harbor. Within days, we drafted a lease that would place the house in their program, ensuring it stayed affordable and safe. In return, I kept a small upstairs studio for myself, a single room with a window that opened toward Casco Bay. When I signed the lease, relief rushed through me. The house would stand, but it would not be a stage for Rogan's ego or my parents' manipulations. It would serve the community that had always surrounded us, and I could step inside only when I chose. That evening, I unlocked the studio and set my bag on the floor. The rooms below would soon belong to another family, their voices replacing the silence. For the first time in weeks, I breathed without weight on my chest, ready to put the rest into writing. I sat in the upstairs studio with the deed and lease papers stacked neatly beside me. The house below would soon welcome another family, and I wanted to set my own boundaries as clearly as the legal lines now drawn. I opened a blank page in my notebook and began the letter to my parents. I wrote without decoration I would not be their rescuer anymore. I would not cover bills, mortgages, or quiet their mistakes. If they wanted any chance of contact, they would have to commit to counseling not as a punishment, but as a condition of trust. I enclosed copies of the receipts, the court order, and the will. I wanted no debate, only clarity. When I sealed the envelope, I felt no tremor in my hands. It was not anger that guided me, but the need to stop repeating the same cycle. A knock at the door startled me. Mrs. Penfield stood there with a small basket of muffins. She smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "For the woman who kept the porch standing," she said. Her words filled the room with a warmth that paper alone could not carry. Later that evening, Tom Keegan stopped me on the street. He clapped my shoulder, his palm heavy with respect. "Silas would have wanted it this way," he said simply, and I believed him. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from Rogan. It was shorter than I expected, stripped of bravado. He admitted his mistakes, spoke of his fear for the future, and asked for time to make things right. For the first time in years, his words did not demand they requested. I left his message unanswered, the letter to my parents ready for the morning mail, knowing the final step was still ahead. Months later, the sound of new footsteps filled the rooms below. A young family had settled in under the land trust lease, their laughter carrying through the floorboards at night. Toys scattered across the porch where I had once stacked storm shutters, and the sight gave me more peace than emptiness ever had. I kept the small studio upstairs, a single room with wide windows facing Casco Bay. Each morning, I opened the curtains to the light stretching over the water, and I felt the steadiness that had been missing for years. On one wall, I hung the framed deed beside Silas's old repair map of Munjoy Hill, the penciled notes marking the years he replaced shingles after hurricanes and reinforced beams after blizzards. It was less a trophy than a compass, reminding me what stewardship truly meant. The space was simple, a desk, a chair, a bed tucked near the window, but it belonged to no one's expectations but mine. I wrote there often, sometimes code for work, sometimes words that would never be sent. Letters to a past self who thought silence was the only way to keep peace. Downstairs, the family painted walls their own colors, filled the kitchen with smells of stews and bread. I heard it all and smiled, because the house was alive in a way that didn't drain me. It stood, not as a bargaining chip or a weapon, but as a place carrying forward. I no longer needed to prove myself with every nail or dollar spent. My worth wasn't hidden in the floorboards or bargained at a dinner table. It rested in the boundary I had drawn, the life I had chosen, and the door I had learned when to close.